Well, thank you very much for joining us. It would be great if you can give us an introduction, if that's okay, just to tell everyone who you are and why you're joining us.
Yeah, so hi, well, thank you for inviting me today. I'm Surash Surash. I'm a neurosurgeon based up in Newcastle. I've come to talk about my work on equality.
So, thank you very much. It would be great if we could perhaps start off and if you could explain to us what prompted you to personally get involved in striving for equality and driving change within the NHS.
Okay, so I think, to try and set a background to all of this. So, I came to England when I was 2. I grew up on the south coast of England, where I was one of probably a handful of kids from an ethnic minority in my school. But that didn't stop me from working hard and excelling. I became a head boy despite the fact there was only a handful of people from ethnic minorities, and I got to where I needed to be. But equally, my mother, who'd come to this country to become an anaesthetist, ended up giving up anesthesia, tried general practice, found it very difficult, and ended up doing community pediatrics. And it used to always bewilder me that she would come home quite often crying because she was frustrated at how she had been marginalised. She couldn't ever develop herself. And she kept being told that she had communication issues, which, as a teenage boy, I couldn't really quite fathom or understand. But it didn't stop me, didn't stop my passion, try and work hard and do what I wanted to do, to be a neurosurgeon. So going to medical school, became a junior doctor, and I pretty much did accelerate throughout my career, became a consultant at a fairly early age. But it's only when I became a consultant that it suddenly started to dawn on me what was going on around me. And I think I was pretty much oblivious to things throughout my training period. So it'd be the subtle nuances of how junior doctors, in particular the local employed trust doctors, were treated compared to a training grade doctors. And we know that the trust doctors tend to be the international medical graduates or doctors from ethnic minorities. Or as a way that people became consultants, and we could see a disparity with recruitment into consultants. But also when you became a consultant, it was the nuances, it was the subtleties of how you would see a white Caucasian colleague get a tap on the shoulder to say, listen, I think you're one of us, you're one of the boys. We're going to make you into a senior clinical manager. Whereas, women and members of from ethnic minorities weren't given that same kind of mentorship or development. And so I then started to reflect upon my own training. And I do think I was pretty much ignorant to what was going on around me, just because I was, I had this toxic ambition to succeed, but I didn't see what was going on around me, recognize it for what it was. So about 3 years ago, there was a article about gender pay gap and the need for it to be reported. And Theresa May, who was Prime Minister at that time, was making an announcement saying that she would also like to do the same with ethnic minorities. So I think I had a few beers. I decided to tweet our chief executive, Dame Jackie Daniel, and our medical director. They both look like fairly sensible, lovely people. So I sent them a tweet saying, wouldn't it be a good idea if we as an organisation could be the first to do that? And within no time at all, I was called to the chief executive's office. Almost felt like a naughty schoolboy. But I have to say, the support I've had from the chief executive and medical director have been absolutely fantastic. Hence why the report was commissioned and the report was subsequently published. I do not hold any position in terms of equality within the country or within my organisation. I'm just a neurosurgeon that's not afraid to speak up and call things out.
Which is fantastic. It's great to hear that you obviously were able to speak out and then actually be able to go on and do something as fantastic as create that report, which I've read, and it is really very interesting and sometimes uncomfortable reading. But I think that's the point of something like that. And just for obviously for our viewers' sake, the report itself was the Surash Pierce report, and it's something that was covered within the CRED report, which is the Commission's report into racial and ethnic disparities in the UK as well, wasn't it? There was a case study included in there. Is it okay if we go through some of the findings from the report? Just the fact that you've mentioned it there, it'd be probably quite nice to go on to that, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
So I know, so one of the things within the report, BME staff at Newcastle Hospital reported they were more likely than white staff to be bullied or harassed by the members of staff. They had less opportunity to progress in their careers, and more discrimination for managers. Could you explain a little bit more about that finding, findings in particular?
So, I mean, I never wrote a report like this in my life, and it's always difficult when you're looking at subjective feelings of people. You know, as a American, as a scientist, I've always tried to see things objectively. So what I started off doing was trying to understand the subjective sense. So at that stage, I went out and spoke to an awful lot of people, and we had a great chair and vice chair at that stage, Odif and Jelly Barney, great people. And I said to them, right, can you, the chair and vice chair of the BAME staff network? So I said to them, right, okay, can you canvass the network and just say to them, you know, can you let us know what you guys have personally experienced? There's no point me as a consultant neurosurgeon saying it, because my experience is very different to people on the ground floor. So see from part of the report, there's that subjective sense, which is the anecdotes of various members of staff from all bands, from all sectors, about how they felt. And I remember there's one particularly good example I always keep quoting, which is of the two doctors. I'm not going to say what specialty they were in, husband and wife team. The wife was a member of the ethnic minority, the husband's Caucasian. And the example given was that whenever the wife walked into a room, she always had to prove herself, to prove that she was good enough to do her job. Whereas the husband would walk into a room and there was this whole air of assumed competence, which is that, he's Caucasian, he's male, he therefore is going to know what he's doing. And, you know, as much as this was in isolation, they're both the same grade, we do see this happen in the NHS all the time. It's not unique. So we took the subjective, the anecdotal stuff, and then we had to try and marry that up with the National Staff Survey. So this is a survey that's done on an annual basis, and you can also break things down by your own organisation. So what I needed to see is whether the anecdotal reports mirrored what we're seeing in the staff survey data. And the staff survey data was what did, as you say, made for quite unpleasant reading as well, because it did show that people were concerned about being bullied and harassed. People were concerned about being discriminated by their managers. And people were concerned that their organisation weren't protecting them. Now, that's not just unique for my organisation. That's actually a reflection of the wider NHS, and it's true for the whole of NHS England. And when you look at staff survey data that's just been produced this year, that data's actually got worse. Now, that could be secondary to Black Lives Matter. People be more aware, it's difficult to say. So we then had two parts of subjective data, which essentially said that staff were unhappy. But the difficulty with subjective data is that people can walk away from it. It's easy to walk away from what can be perceived as whinging, people's anxieties, because it's really going to be about the objective side, which is, where my background really is. So we then looked at three specific staff groups for the medics, nursing staff, and managers. And what we did was we looked at career progression, and in medics, we looked at pay awards. To basically ask the question, right, if people on the shop floor are basically saying that they're not being supported, not doing development, well, let's see that. Let's see whether that's actually true. Are people becoming consultants, people become senior managers, are nursing staff becoming band 6, band 7, and etc., and same with managers. And what we found was actually the objective data just for our trust did support that. So what we did was we married the subjective data, which was difficult in itself to understand. We married that with the objective data, which supported that subjective experience. So what we did was it was a 360-degree analysis to essentially prove that actually there is an issue. Now, I suspect we are on one end of the spectrum there with Newcastle, because our demographics different to the demographics of London or any other bigger city. But I suspect if you then replicate our data for every organisation within NHS England, you probably see some fairly uncomfortable data.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few points within that report itself. I mean, obviously the ones that I've just mentioned, obviously you've been talking about there. But there was obviously one of the other findings to do with the fact that a white applicant to a consultant job was more likely to be shortlisted and more likely to be successful at an interview. I think the relative likelihood was 1.53, I think it was. Can you explain why you think that is, and how potentially that could be changed, or how you think that may be changed?
Okay, so when I go back to when I started medical school in 1994, so some time ago now, I looked around the room, half the medical student intake were probably women, and half were from an ethnic minority. We know from the current data, when you look at what the res are producing, is that medical schools these days are a fairly even balance. Junior doctors, we know that junior doctors in training actually have a disproportionately higher percentage of doctors from ethnic minorities compared to the general population. And yet, as soon as you get to consultant position, especially when you look at the teaching hospital super centres, that representation suddenly falls. Now, this is no way a reflection that for some reason ethnic minorities aren't successful enough, aren't good enough, but there's some kind of bias, there's some kind of block. But you also then look at the senior management structure. You look at your CDs, your AMDs, your medical directors, and talk about across the entire country. And again, those numbers fall once again. So there's clearly a separation that occurs at consultant level, because during training, junior doctors are pretty much protected by the deaneries, by Health Education England as it is now, or the deaneries as it was in my day. And during medical school, you're really competing against yourself. You're not competing against anybody else. But as soon as you get to that magic consultant position, it all changes. And protectionism, whether that's conscious or unconscious, suddenly changes. And that's the difficulty that we have at the moment, is that you still have that cliff edge where as soon as you want to go to that magic consultancy, the proportion of ethnic minorities and women drops.
You mentioned the fact that this is also to do with, that there's a bias to do with women as well involved here as well. So I know that one of the other findings was to do with additional programme activities and female consultants lagging behind male consultants. And that's something that's also in other reports as well. There's definite statistics within certain reports that show certain females within certain ethnic minorities get the worst treatment effectively. What are your thoughts on that?
So, I mean, Dame Jane Dackworth produced a fantastic report not so long ago on gender pay gap. I wouldn't wish to speak on her behalf. All I can say is, looking at the data that we produce from our report. So, for me, equality has to be about taking an intersectional approach. And what we found now, one must remember that there's still very much a historic legacy over female career progression, women taking part-time, women not necessarily, women taking time off for children, for maternity leave, of course. So the data is slightly skewed on that, because what we're looking at is whole-time equivalence. But if you start looking at the intersectional approach, which is to look at not just gender, but also ethnicity as well. So if you look at our data, we know that if you're a woman from an ethnic minority, you do worse than a woman who is Caucasian. So not only do we see, well, essentially what we are seeing is a double hit effect. And, we're seeing this in pay awards, we're seeing this up and down the country, and I've not done a subset analysis of a gender pay gap award, but it would certainly look like there is a double hit effect, and, women of ethnic minorities are by far doing worse than women who are from a Caucasian background.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It definitely is interesting reading from some of the things that I've read. It's if people want to have a look, there's quite a few different reports on that. So yeah, it's definitely worth looking into. So in relation to the Clinical Excellence Award, locally, ethnic minority consultants make 24.5% less than a white consultant, compared with national awards, which is only 5.4% less, I believe. Can you explain a little bit more about that for us?
So, Clinical Excellence Awards is a double-edged sword. It is there inherently to award excellence, but what we do know is that that excellence isn't necessarily the the prerogative of the consultant who is going for the award. And actually, it is a reflection of that consultant's team, which is, the junior doctors, the nursing staff, the allied health professionals. So if we're going to award excellence, it should be to the team and not to the individual. Now, some may ask, why do we have competitive awards at all? Now, whether we like it or not, medicine is an extraordinarily competitive field. It is a profession based on altruism, but is based on its clinicians having the selfish gene in order to go to where they need to be. I'm not saying that's true of all consultants. I'm just saying, that is a general reflection. Now, the question that's been posed over the last few years is should we be doing it? Now, there's going to be and there is a huge cohort of consultants who still want to have competitive awards because, that I have heard the comments, well, why should that consultant who doesn't do anything gain from awards when they've not done anything, whereas I've worked really hard? So you can understand why consultants, to a degree, still want to have a competitive process toward the hard work that they have done. But as I've said already, that's actually a reflection of their team, not just of them. Right, so the next part is, well, okay, are competitive awards meritocratic? So is it actually based on how good you have done and generally how you have done, or is it still a reflection of the old boys network, which unfortunately has been what has been plagued by for a number of years? And I remember seeing a list from one of the colleges for national awards, and it was a college of society, sorry, and they gave all the people in their organisation who were the national leaders. They've done well, so there's local awards, there's national awards. And the list was basically white and male. And it was fairly obvious, how the system has worked. And the difficulty with these awards is that once you get paid it, that's it. It's with you for the rest of your life. It's abhorrent, it really is. So what we did locally was to look at whether there was a difference between local and national awards, and also on a gender and ethnic minority basis. And what we found on the local award was that there was a disparity in the year that we looked at. And that disparity wasn't just there for ethnic minorities, but it was also there on a gender bias as well. And what we found was that a female consultant from an ethnic minority was more likely to apply, but was financially less likely to benefit from this. So if you took an intersectional approach, you could see that being a ethnic minority woman in the NHS, you were fairly hard done by. So we then said, right, okay, so local award is done by a local award committee, but if it's done to a national scale, how is that difference then reflected? And what we found was that difference went from 24% to, 5.4%? So there's something that's happening on a national level that's not happening on a local level. And I remember after the report was published, consultants from across the organisation contacted me privately. And one particular stands back in mind, which was a consultant who had continuously got frustrated over the local award process, but found it easier to apply for a national award than it was for a local award. So then one must ask yourself, so what is still happening nationally that's happening locally? And you've got to ask yourself whether these awards, if they were done objectively, if they were done external to an organisation, so there was no vested interest, there was none of this, oh, I know this chap, he's a good egg, he's therefore going to get an award compared to the rest of you. So if you do it objectively like that and external, it may actually level that process. Now, there are advocates in this country who want to see awards completely dismissed. Now, I'm equivocal on this, and I know I'm sitting on the fence, but I understand why awards exist. But for me, it has to be meritocratic, and I think being external is by far the best way forward for this.
One of the other things in the CRED report that I'd like to cover is that as a whole, we should commission a strategic review of the causes of this disparate pay, and where discrimination is obviously pinpointed, spell out the measures that might address it. It would be great to get your thoughts on how easy you think that would be, because obviously that's me quoting there the recommendation, but obviously that's something that needs to be implemented, and obviously how easy do you think that would be?
So, trying to put aside my own personal feelings about the CRED report, I think there is a great difficulty here, and that the nation has gone into report fatigue. There's an awful lot of them, whether it's gender pay gap, ethnic minority gaps, COVID reports, the CRED report came out, you have a Black Lives Movement, of course, and I think the difficulty is you can commission umpteen reports and it's still probably not going to change the narrative. And what the CRED report did was it failed to see the wood from the trees. And a good example of that was in their discussion about NHS pay gap, where they quoted, my report as an example of that. They talk about, on one hand, that looking at the 2019 data, that a male Asian worker does better than a Caucasian male worker. This is based on extraordinary erroneous data, and looks at all staff groups. And yet it then decided to quote my report, and in its summary points out the fact that actually there is ethnic pay gap data. So you kind of wondered what these guys were thinking when they put their report together. So in terms of recommendations, well, we already have a res team who are doing a fantastic job in putting together ethnic minority staffing data and pay gaps. But ultimately, you can have as many reports as you want, but unless there is serious, firm accountability, and by that I mean ensuring that NHS organisations are made accountable if their organisations continuously fail to improve discrimination, improve pay gaps, improve career progression, then unfortunately it means nothing. There has to be traction. There has to be accountability. Continuously by having this, this comes back to the old Winston Churchill quote, and I'll paraphrase it. We need less Georgia. We need more war, which basically means we need to stop talking about it. We need to actually start doing something about it. And by holding individual employing trust to account, by making sure NHS England actually start having those difficult conversations with individual trust, then nothing is actually going to change.
I hear a lot about the words microaggressions, and there's something that, as we've said, are covered in some of the reports, and they are definitely something that people experience on a daily basis. Now, as well as obviously in terms of the bigger picture, there's definitely something that needs to be done in terms of stopping those microaggressions that people tend to get away with. I mean, what do you think can be done to combat that kind of behaviour in the workplace?
I think, microaggressions was first coined back in the 70s. This is quite some time ago, but it's actually become more apparent within our psyche for the last probably 5 to 10 years. It's taken 30, 40 years for it to become a real talking point. So, there's been this move from an obvious macroaggression, an obvious racist slur, such as "you don't belong here," to "we're not going to employ you because of the colour of your skin," or "we're not going to employ you because you're a woman." So, people have walked away from that to microaggressions. So what's an example of a microaggression? The obvious one is you're sitting with a group of colleagues, someone comes along and says, all right, listen, so talks to one of your colleagues and says, let's go for coffee. Everybody walks up, apart from you, you're left on your own, but you happen to be the only person from an ethnic minority that happens to be sitting there. Or, there's a dinner invite that's sent out, and it's sent out to everybody apart from the people who are from a certain demographic. Other examples, so the ones which always entertain me when it's said to me, but I kind of just water of ducks back for me, which is, "Oh, Surash, you speak English better than we do," or "Surash, you're more English than I am." and you think to yourself, well, actually, it's more of a stupid comment, isn't it? So, these are examples of microaggressions. So these are the smaller nuances. And it's very much there. And a lot of this can be done unconsciously. And a lot of it can be done without the intent of malice. But I do think when you look at how macro-racism used to be, people have almost gone underground with the way they do things. The subtle tapping on the shoulder. I'm going to give you a position of responsibility compared to somebody else. And it's those types of interactions which people, it does affect people, and it affects people's ability to progress in their careers. It affects people's ability to see their own self-worth as well. I mean, a good example from my own background, when I was a junior doctor, I worked on a surgical firm. There were 3 of us, all of the same grade. I remember once being in the canteen with my consultants. He said to me, "So why haven't you done a project yet?" I said, "What are you talking about? Nobody's asked me about doing a project." And he said, "Well, the other 2 colleagues, they're doing projects and they're almost ready." And the other 2 colleagues were Caucasian and male. And I thought, didn't think anything of it. But, I got on there, and in the end, I was able to publish and presented nationally on it. But it's just subtle nuances of how people can be mentored and people can be treated very differently. So what can you do about it? And it's extraordinarily difficult. So if you look at the Equality Act, which is set in stone in order to prevent discrimination. Now, to prove discrimination is extraordinarily difficult in law. And most unions will not take trust to task unless they can prove that there's a greater than 51% chance of winning. Because at the end of the day, it is a major financial undertaking for a union, but you've got to be fairly convinced you're going to win. And the difficulty with discrimination is you've got to prove it. And the difficulty when it comes to microaggressions is you can't, which is why the report was really there, because it's trying to match the objective data sets with the subjective field. So if the subjective field was there were microaggressions, the objective data was that actually proved that those microaggressions were real. And that's the difficulty of microaggressions. It's extraordinarily difficult to actually prove, and difficult to therefore prove in court, and difficult to get HR departments to support people in proving them as well.
On the RCS report, covered the topic of workplace bullying within the surgical community. Is it something that you were aware of before this, or that you have ever experienced yourself personally?
Yeah, so I think surgery has always attracted a certain personality profile. But the reality is, I know surgeons of all different types of personalities, and I fully accept I'm on one side of that spectrum. But I know consultant surgeons who are not, and they are excellent surgeons. They've got excellent patient interactions. So I think we do need to walk away from the stereotype of a consultant surgeon needs to be that chap Lancelot from Doctor in the House. Thankfully those days have gone. So have I seen bullying occur? Yes, I have. Have I been subjected to bullying? Yes, I absolutely have. And did anybody help me? No, I didn't. And that was actually part of resilience training as a junior doctor in surgery, is that you had to, it was the old expression at that stage, which was you had to man up and get on with it. I remember one boss of mine saying to me one day, because I was doing a 72-hour shift, he wanted the paper in by the Monday morning. And I said, I'm sorry, I just can't get it to you. I'm working continuously. He said, are you a surgeon or aren't you a surgeon? Anyway, needless to say, I got the report into him. So yes, it absolutely does or had happened. As to whether it happens so much now, I think the macro bullying has probably gone or isn't as profound as it used to be. But I think the microaggressions in surgery absolutely does exist. And when you read the Barnes Kennedy report, when you look at some of the anecdotes, it is absolutely still there. And these are junior doctors in surgery who are recounting these episodes. It is still pretty much prevalent. But as much as I admire the college and Barnes Kennedy for writing their report, what it did is it focused on what the college could do, which was brilliant. Don't get me wrong, but the college is one of 4 surgical colleges. But what it doesn't do is put ownership or put responsibility on individual surgeons at individual hospitals, whether that's district general hospitals or large tertiary hospitals, to actually put the focus on them. Because the reality is, we can talk to the cows come home, and we can have as many able-bodied leaders as we want to nationally talk about how this is important for equality, this is what we're going to do for our organisation. But until you actually, and I always give this analogy at work, until the worker bees on the shop floor actually tangibly start to appreciate the differences, that actually equality has never been achieved.
Thank you. I mean, it's an interesting point, like you say. It's something that needs to happen, and it's hard to get that to that point, though, isn't it? It's hard to get individuals, after having that report. Where do you then get to that point where individuals then have the understanding and the change? So it's definitely something that needs work on, but hopefully we'll start to see some changes. Obviously, COVID's had quite a disproportionate effect on those within the BAME healthcare community. We've seen it on the news. We've obviously seen it reported. Why do you think that is?
So I'll put a disclaimer out first. My views have been controversial at best on this. So there's absolutely the data to support that within this country, members from ethnic minorities have been disproportionately affected. There is absolutely good evidence to prove that healthcare workers have just been disproportionately been affected by COVID. So we need to then think to ourselves, right, let's look at this objectively. What is actually happening? So to simply say that people from ethnic minorities suffer worse would be then to say that anyone from ethnic minorities, from anyone from anywhere apart from England who isn't white, is going to be disproportionately affected. But hold on a second here. We know that from Singapore and South Korea, who have done extraordinarily well, they haven't been as affected. We've not seen the explosions around the rest of the country that we've necessarily seen in the UK. And we know that UK has been one of the worst countries affected by this. So it isn't just a matter of genetics. So then you've got to ask yourself, right, so what is it in our country that perhaps is happening? Is it the effects on mobility? Is it, the associated disease in terms of diabetes? Is it the multi-generational households? It is multifactorial. Well, there's also one other issue which people seem to be lacking when addressing when it comes to this debate, which is education and support. So what we know from the subjective data that's coming up from staff groups across the country, especially when COVID first hit and people were being redeployed, is that people from ethnic minority staff groups were being sent into frontline positions without adequate training, without adequate PPE, and you can then understand why things weren't going right and why people were perhaps dying disproportionately compared to their Caucasian counterparts. So I think there's a lot to all of this. We know that people are being more affected from ethnic minorities, absolutely. But we need to look at the root cause of this and see what we as a society and as an employer can do to try and protect and mitigate against this. And supporting, training, educating, the correct PPE, all these things are so vitally important. It is not just the fact that we're from ethnic minorities. There's a lot more to this. And when you look at the rest of the world, that argument's flawed.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that you raised there. Like you say, when you compare our data with other areas of the world, it then obviously does change things significantly, really. And there definitely needs to be more review of that. Within the reports, there's been some recommendations to move away from the term BAME, from the aspect of the fact that it is a generalisation. It's something that covers a lot of groups of people, when actually there are very different outcomes. There's different specific ethnic groups included within that. Do you agree with the recommendation that we move away from using that term so that we can focus a bit more on specific groups as opposed to one general term?
So, again, I'm going to be blatantly honest here. Prior to about 5-10 years ago, I didn't even know what the term BAME was. And when I speak to some of our junior doctors from ethnic minorities, they'll say, what's BAME? Who's BAME? Why am I BAME? So BAME is Black and Asian minority ethnic. It then changed to Black and minority ethnic. So a lacuna suddenly occurred. A schism suddenly appeared from nowhere. We then ended up having this hierarchy of nomenclature. So from my perspective, and I've been an advocate of this and I've campaigned for this, I do not agree with anybody being a label. So my children, for example, will never, point, say, somebody at a different end of the room, we're not going to talk to, describe them by their skin color. Because why should we? Or, why should we be described by our ethnic, our ethnic background? We're all individuals. I'm very much against using labels. I think labels are not helpful. What labels does is tries to put every single person who's non-Caucasian into the same group. Now, you cannot tell me that somebody from the African subcontinent is the same as somebody from the Asian subcontinent, somebody from the American subcontinent, somebody from the Australian subcontinent. But if you look at the onus data, which is what trusts use to look at ethnic minorities, white basically encompasses everybody. So all of a sudden, anybody that's white from South Africa, Australia, America, Europe, it's suddenly the same. It's nonsense. There are greater differences, amongst individuals. A bit like gender, there are great differences amongst individuals than there are actually between male and female gender. So we desperately do need to move away from labels. Now, I have used quite a number of times the word ethnic minorities in this conversation, and I continue to use it. I do not like the term BAME. And when it comes to ethnic minorities, again, it is an all-encompassing term. But we also need to be mindful that you cannot treat everybody necessarily the same, because everybody has different experiences. So, and I keep saying, harping on about this, which is a first-generation member of staff will have a different experience to a second-generation member of staff. For example, coming back to the start when I was talking about my mother and her bad experience that she had, whereas I grew up in this country. So I knew how the game was going to be played. I was savvy. I knew what courses to do. Whereas an international medical graduate, for example, won't necessarily know the right courses to go on or what to write on an application. So, is success based on your ability to be familiar? Yes, it absolutely is. And part of the things that I, go on about when it comes to trying to address and help people is you hold sessions, you teach people, right, this is the best way to answer a question in an interview. This is the best way to answer or to phrase your personal statement in your application. Or these are the appropriate course for you to go on in order for you to then apply for that next job. And what we do know is people who are trained or people who are brought up or live in this country is that we know that. Because this is the way we're brought up, or you've got good mentors who can help you. So part of it is also having mentors who can help people from first generation or subsequent in order to be able to be savvy and to be able to progress. So I realise I've gone completely off path there when it comes to the description of minorities. But I'm just trying to give an example of how, that terminology can be translated, but how it's also unhelpful at the same time.
No, not at all. It definitely makes sense. And like you say, it's something that what you've explained there is a way in the fact of why it doesn't work to group people together, because there are very different experiences depending on, like you say, whether first generation or second generation, and whether you've grown up in this country. Like you say, you know exactly what needs to be written on an application, and that's something that can be applied to people, and it's not something that should be missed. They should be able to access that kind of mentorship to be able to get that information. So yeah, no, 100%, it's definitely valid. And then it actually moves me on to my next question. Looking forward to the future, say 5 years time, where are you hoping that this country and the NHS will be in terms of equality and inclusivity?
So there's a chap called Andrew Foster, who was the chief executive of Wigan Trust, I think about 10 years ago. Was talking about what leadership should actually be. So leadership is about being able to make the difficult decisions, to identify what needs to be done and what needs to be changed. And part of that is to identify those future leaders who are on board, who are compassionate, and who do believe. So if I was to design a new NHS England, what would I do? I would change the leadership structure. Well, not structure, I would change those who are in the leadership positions to have those, a bit like a chief executive, who are completely on board, who understand what needs to happen. But it's also about changing the middle managers as well. It's all very well, saying, well, we can train them. Unconscious bias training does not work because bias is ingrained into people. So I'll start by actually changing that. I'd also try and walk away from this no blame culture. There's a no blame culture, and I've heard middle managers say, well, you can't come after me. There's no blame culture. You can't do that. So we need to walk away from that as well. We need to have accountability. So we need to have individual employing trusts holding people accountable. But at the moment, they don't. There is a resistance. And of course, as I said to you before, it's difficult to prove it as well. So then NHS England need to start taking a more proactive stance. And coming back to my paraphrase before, it's more war, less jaw. So it's about trying to hold individual trusts accountable. Now, we already know that organisations for a number of years have had sequence targets, which means that if they do not reach a certain target, they become financially accountable for that. So why can't we make trusts? Why can't we make HR and OD departments accountable? So if you have the National Staff Survey and they continue to deteriorate, well, surely the HR OD departments in those trusts need to be accountable for that. They need to explain to the board and their non-executive board of directors why it is they're continuously failing to achieve. We need that accountability. We need a change in leadership. You cannot continue with the same current structure because ultimately these people got to their positions because of that selfish gene. But we now need the altruistic gene to kick in. But we need to identify those leaders and middle managers and senior managers who actually buy into it. It's not just a matter of saying, yes, I do. You've got to speak up. And, this is why, allies are so important. Allies need to do more than just say, yes, I'm an ally, I believe. Allies actually need to go, right, I'm calling you out. I don't care if you're a colleague. I don't care if you're male, white, or middle class. I'm going to call you out and I'm going to make sure you're accountable. So if you ask me what the future NHS should look like, it should be accountable. We need to be able to actually have traction. We need to stop hiding and burying our heads in the sand and make sure that HR, who is there to protect our members of staff, do that and do that objectively and do it robustly.
Thank you. One last point that I'd like to cover. I mean, obviously, we're speaking from an industry perspective, from obviously where we're from. What do you think industry can do, if anything, to help with this kind of conversation and with effectively, as you were just saying, being an ally but actually being involved?
So I've always found it interesting when I speak to friends of mine who are in private industry. And, you talk to them about how their HR deals with things and how our HR deals with things. And I'm talking about, over the last 20 years. I'm not talking about, the last few years. And you kind of get the sense that private industry are far more proactive in terms of dealing with problems, dealing with discrimination, especially gender discrimination. They've been very proactive and very, very good at dealing with that. And I think they just need to continue to be a leading light in this. I'm not saying they get it all right, because we know from various case law examples that there are problems in private industry. Nobody has a perfect model. But I think what private industry can do is continue to strive to be the best it can, in the same way the NHS needs to continue to strive the best they can be.